The struggle between Bruno's gang and the rest of Passione, be it either La Squadra or Unità Speciale, throughout the course of Part 5, made for some of the most tense fights in the series, with both sides of the fight playing for keeps, resulting in one of the bloodiest parts in all of JoJo. And even though death was a looming threat from the beginning, it wasn't really felt until one specific member brought that looming feeling into reality. This came in the form of the raging but resourceful remaining La Squadra member, Ghiaccio, and his stand, White Album.
He's gonna take you back to the past to play the shitty games that suck ass. He'd rather have a buffalo take a diarrhea dump in his ear. He'd rather eat the rotten asshole of a roadkill skunk and down it with beer. He's the angriest gamer you've ever heard. He's the angry Nintendo nerd. He's the angry Atari Sega nerd. He's the angry video game nerd.
Ghiaccio is the last member of La Squadra that faces off against Bruno's gang, and the second last member that we see in the fight. And of La Squadra, they really were saving the best for last, as Ghiaccio might be the most intimidating member of the gang, with his unrelenting determination and sheer resourcefulness that makes him a true threat that even drove the cool and collected Giorno into a corner. Though, before we get too into that, we should discuss the meaning behind Ghiaccio's name and design. Ghiaccio's name is a very simple one that directly translates to the Italian word for ice, which not only plays well with its creation process, as Araki wanted to create a fight where someone was to ice skate down a freeway, but also plays well as a sort of irony based on his personality, as he is constantly hot-headed and getting heated about things, so it's ironic that his name means ice. Though the major reason that the name was chosen was likely to play off the nature of his stand, White Album. White Album is a close-range stand which takes the form of a wearable suit that fully covers Ghiaccio in a slim version of an antique diver suit, even down to the helmet mostly obscuring the face, which is actually why Araki gave Ghiaccio thick-rimmed glasses, so that the readers would understand that he was within the stand. Also, Ghiaccio has a large W on the rim of his glasses since we're talking about them, which likely stands for White Album. Alongside this, the design of White Album seems to be styled after that of a Japanese Oni, with the helmet adorned with two horns and the main design aesthetic being a big swirl down the middle of the helmet itself, which is reminiscent of the classic curly hair of an Oni. This is also seen in Ghiaccio's main design, as his hair is also naturally swirly. Along with this, his demeanor matches well with the nature of an Oni, as Onis would often hide themselves away and wait to strike someone when they're vulnerable, because the name Oni actually originates from the word to hide or to conceal, which not only matches up with how White Album introduces Ghiaccio and its stand, but also the Oni-shaped suit appearing after Ghiaccio's been discovered is like when you find an Oni. Also, in a metaphorical sense, Ghiaccio is concealing himself within the armor in a similar way that an Oni would conceal their presence. And how the stand can act as armor comes down to its major ability, this being true cryokinesis. How true cryokinesis works is it allows the user to completely control the temperature of anything which it is in contact with. This includes even the air around them. And on top of that, there doesn't even seem to be a limit to how cold you can make something, though the colder something gets, the more stand energy it costs to maintain, though, as a reference, we see him maintain temperatures as low as negative 100 degrees Celsius or negative 150 degrees Fahrenheit without much effort. And at such a low temperature, objects affected by this become dangerous to the touch, freezing over pieces of the body to the point that they can be easily broken off like ice. As seen when Mista touches a slowly freezing window, it freezes over his pinky finger and numbs it to the point that he doesn't even realize it when he unintentionally rips it off due to some 15-year-old driver. And of course, if White Album touches someone directly, he can just flash freeze them and break them to his discretion, as seen when he was about to shatter Mista's hand before Gold Experience hit him. Which also brings me to another point. On top of all of this dangerous freezing ability, the ice produced by White Album can also affect and damage stands. With this in mind, Ghiaccio can use his true cryokinesis to wrap himself in a layer of ice armor forged from the moisture in the air around him. This ice armor is nearly invulnerable, as the cold aura radiating off of it slows or even cancels out movement, which is an effect that seems to be based on a literal take of the concept of absolute zero, where at negative 230 degrees Celsius, all motion and matter is halted. halted. So the closer something gets to White Album, the slower and more motionless it gets until it is stopped, and sometimes this can cause an object to float in the middle of the air. And on top of that, he doesn't have to worry about freezing himself, as the suit that he creates works under the same properties of an igloo, with the ice keeping the inside insulated and warm. Along with this, through true cryokinesis, he can freeze the ice in any shape that he chooses, as seen when he creates literal ice skates to chase after and catch up to a car. And it's White Album's ice armor that makes a lot of conventional attacks like bullets and punches basically useless. But it does have two weak points. First, of course, if you just build up enough force with a large enough object, you can pierce through its pretty basic defenses, as it is only as hard as ice, though this may require you to hit that larger object multiple times to actually send it through the armor itself, as seen when Mista hammers a metal bolt through the helmet. The second being that White Album also appears to have a breathing vent on its back, which is a very Death Star-like weak point. But being the resourceful man that Ghiaccio is, he actually has solutions for these weaknesses, and these solutions come in the form of his secondary ability, Gently Weeps. Gently Weeps is when Ghiaccio brings the temperature around him down to an insanely cold level, somewhere around negative 110 degrees Celsius or negative 346 degrees Fahrenheit, and these temperatures are so cold that the air around him begins to freeze. This includes the air inside his vent, completely sealing his armor from any outside attack. And given Ghiaccio's White Album's coldness effect causes movement to stop, the air around him begins to forge these air crystals that have their motion suspended given White Album's ice aura. And with these air crystals orbiting around him and with him having full control over their structure, he can position them in a way that allows him to bounce projectiles away from him and towards his attacker, preventing both the hammering a hard object through him or just being attacked in general. It protects him on both fronts. It also helps that the air crystals are nearly invisible to the eye, so much so that Giorno had to cover them in blood to make them stand out. And Ghiaccio shows that in this state, he doesn't need his air vent, as Gently Weeps effect allows him to just absorb frozen ice crystals and then unfreeze them within his suit, allowing him to breathe easy like a diver's suit. And the only reason that he doesn't use this ability constantly is because it drains his stand energy really quickly, as it's literally double the amount of effort, and he's constantly balancing between freezing and unfreezing things at a rapid succession, so it could take his mind off the fight as well. Though this ability does open up a new weakness, that being that anything that comes in contact with White Album will freeze instantly, and it's hard for him to focus on unfreezing it immediately, as seen when Mista temporarily blinds Ghiaccio by covering his mask with blood, causing him to have to dig it away with his hands. Along with this, Gently Weeps only prevents projectiles from getting close to Ghiaccio, and it doesn't prevent Ghiaccio from falling onto something sharp, and that's his actual biggest weakness, as the weight of White Album works completely against him, as if he falls on something sharp or heavy, it will go clean through the armor, as it weighs a ton, doesn't have enough defense to block the sharp object, and will just end up stabbing him. Though, if he does get desperate enough, he can use his blood to support himself from falling any deeper onto sharp objects if he bleeds a lot. So he does even have a solution for that, though this is his desperate solution and is not perfect. Now, the name White Album originates from the 9th studio album and one of the most important ones for the English rock band, The Beatles, simply called The Beatles, but often referred to as The White Album, given it was released with a pure white sleeve with the only graphic on it being the name of the band. And many aspects of this album can be seen in Ghiaccio's own character, starting first with how during the recording of White Album, a lot of personal issues between the Beatles came up, with members like Paul McCartney and John Lennon saying things during interviews that during the recording of that album, the Beatles' breakup was looming and could be felt, and clearly heard in the songs in that album. This anger stemmed from each member increasingly becoming an individual talent and wanting to branch out as their own artist, which in turn caused their egos to collide. This is represented best both in La Squadra, as their decision to try to break away from Passione came from them feeling they were too talented to be treated the way that they were, but also in Ghiaccio's own personality, with his general cockiness when it came to handling people like Giorno or Mista, feeling that he was better than them, much like how most of the Beatles felt that they were becoming better than each individual member, or in his pent-up anger and rage, with him constantly externally and aggressively criticizing things, which is similar to how Paul McCartney and John Lennon tore down each other's own composition when forging songs for the album. We also see David Production actions expand on Ghiaccio's own ego in extended scenes in the anime, with either more upfront scenes like him referring to his squad as the best in Passione, or him getting overly upset at a payout which didn't match what he considered to be his team's high standards. But even in subtle details like Ghiaccio referring to Polpo, one of Passione's capos, and a close personal friend to the boss, as Volvo, an old Italian phrase for I roll, basically calling him so fat that he'd have to roll places, which is extra disrespectful and shows how little he cared about someone so high up when he says this when informing people about his death. Alongside this, the secondary ability of White Album, Gently Weeps, is based on a song on the album itself, called My Guitar Gently Weeps, which was written by George Harrison, and the song itself's origin comes from Harrison's introduction to I Ching, or the Book of Changes, an ancient Chinese divination text which speaks about how outcomes that we assume are based on chance or random rolls are actually fated to occur by higher powers or supernatural beings. And given JoJo and Part 5 specifically's deep connection to fate, it makes sense why this song name was chosen specifically to be directly referenced in the ability, but we also see it in how White Album uses this ability to redirect bullets back at a target with a string of seemingly random ice crystals which were set up by the stand itself. And there are other songs in the album that seem to have inspired aspects of the fight in a way, two random examples being like Happiness is a Warm Gun, with Mista using an endless barrage of bullets throughout the fight that also end up saving his life, or on how a lot of the tone of the fight seems to be very Helter Skelter inspired, with its non-stop intensity and how Ghiaccio spirals downward into his own defeat, with the weight of his stand literally being his downfall. The one personality trait of Ghiaccio that I wanted to take a closer look at is his fixation on language and phrasing, as it is one of his most standout features. He is so unnecessarily analytical at times, dissecting common terms of phrases to their essential elements and taking each part literally, and then becoming overly frustrated with the fact that they don't actually make sense when you look at them that way. This is seen best in the moment where Ghiaccio is overanalyzing the Japanese phrase "nihori hahori," which means thoroughly, or to do something thoroughly, and is comprised of nihori, which means root digging, and hahori, which means leaf digging. So altogether, it's a phrase that means if you want to do something thoroughly, you're not done until you've dug through the leaves and the brushes and gotten to the root of the problem, while also emphasizing that you have to constantly dig deeper to do something thoroughly. It's not something you're supposed to take literally, though Ghiaccio does. But that rant doesn't translate well to English, so localization teams have changed this to be a line that makes more sense to an English reader, while also keeping consistent with Ghiaccio taking his term of phrase too literally. And in my opinion, the Colored Adventure team's fan translation does it the best. Come Hell or High Water works the best because it's a common enough phrase that everyone will get it, and it's something that if you do break it down makes complete sense, because if you take it too literally, you're not really getting what's being said, and it's leagues better than Crunchyroll's stupid take a leaf, like who the fuck calls a page a leaf anymore, or the dub's oversimplified thinking outside the box rant, which was just really flaccid in comparison. Though Ghiaccio also overthinks the pronunciation of specific words as well, specifically the names of places, with one of his most famous rants being how he's upset that Paris or Paris is spoken correctly outside of English all around the world, but Venezia is called Venice all over the world, which frustrates him deeply, causing him to scream out how it should be said correctly. It's Italian, speak fucking Italian. Though these rants may seem like they're out of nowhere, and a lot of people interpret them out of nowhere, they actually do have a reason for happening. And this is because his stand requires him to be overly analytical, as White Album is an ability that requires a user to be thinking out his next step ahead of time, as he needs to manage what needs to be frozen, what needs to be unfrozen, what should be thawed, what needs to be brought up to a specific temperature, and this burden on him increases when Gently Weep is activated as well, as he not only needs to maintain all of that, but he needs to pull in air crystals, and so he overanalyzes a lot of things. Which then, when you see the internal logic that leads him to those rants, you'll understand why those rants happen in the first place. The first rant, as we see in the source material, comes from when he's talking about having to deal with Bruno's gang thoroughly. He then focuses on the word thoroughly, overthinks it, and begins to rant on the fact that thoroughly, when broken down, makes no sense. And then you have his Venezia rant, which comes after him speaking about having to kill both Giorno Cirno and Mista as they enter the city of Venezia, meaning that there would be a death in Venezia, which is one of the stories that he mentions isn't ever pronounced correctly. It's always called Death in Venice, which then causes him to overthink how Paris is pronounced correctly, but Venezia is never pronounced correctly. That then causes that tangent. He has an internal logic to his rantings, and that's one of the coolest things about Ghiaccio, and it's one of the things that makes me absolutely love him. He's one of, if not my absolute favorite character in all of JoJo. He's someone who can be overly analytical to a fault, cocky and loud, and still manage to back up all his talk, being a sheer force of nature and only undone by his own defense. And I'm glad that David Productions gave a little small addition to his character that fit well with his egotistical mentality, and much like the album that he draws reference to, the fight that takes place between him and Giorno and Mista is my absolute favorite fight in the series. Though I want to save discussing that fight too deeply for its own video, as I feel there's enough content discussing that fight as a whole for its own video. So until then, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more videos like in the future, I have a Patreon at patreon.com/MetiNotTheBadGuy. And if you want to experience a tundra of blue, well, you can do that at Shimonetta, a boring world where the concept of dirty jokes doesn't exist, at ByShimonetta.com.